The morning I stopped being able to have children, I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the breakfast dishes. The cramps had been coming for 3 days. I knew what they meant. I had been pregnant 7 times. I knew what losing one felt like. What I did not know, standing at that sink with the water running cold over my hands, was that this was also the morning I began losing something else. Something I had no name for yet. Something I would spend the next 4 years watching disappear piece by piece, quietly, in plain sight, in the house I had kept, and the bed I had shared, and the life I had built entirely around a man who was now, I would learn, permitted by the laws of my community to simply begin again. Without me. Stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you about what Amish husbands are allowed to do when a wife can no longer bear children is going to make you sit very still. And if you grew up in a world anything like mine, it is going to sound uncomfortably familiar. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio. I left several years ago, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths like this one, please subscribe and tap the like button. And drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me explain something that took me a long time and a great deal of therapy to understand fully. In Amish theology, a wife has a purpose. That purpose is not stated cruelly. It is stated plainly, the way you state facts about farming or weather. A wife bears children, raises them in the faith, keeps the home, submits to her husband, and serves the community. These are not suggestions. They are the architecture of what a woman is for. And when a woman can no longer perform one of those functions, the community does not grieve alongside her. It begins, quietly and without malice, to ask what comes next. The theology rests on 3 pillars, and none of them have room for a woman whose body has stopped cooperating. The first pillar is fruitfulness as duty. In my community, children were not simply a blessing. They were evidence of obedience. A large family meant a faithful couple. A couple without children, or with too few, carried a quiet stigma that nobody named directly but everyone could feel in the length of a pause, in the way a conversation shifted, in the particular way older women looked at you across a table at a quilting bee. I had 5 children. By any count, I had fulfilled this. But the community did not count backward. It only counted forward. And forward, for me, had stopped. The second pillar is the husband's spiritual authority. In Old Order Amish tradition, the husband is the head of the household in a way that is not metaphorical. His decisions carry the weight of spiritual leadership. If he determines that something needs to change in the home, the church does not question that determination. The Ordnung, the set of community rules that governs every visible inch of Amish life, gives him that authority. What the Ordnung does not do is define clearly what that authority looks like when a marriage has become, in the community's eyes, incomplete. The third pillar is silence as protection. Discussing the private arrangements of a marriage was considered deeply immodest. What happened between a husband and wife, and what a husband decided about his household, was not community business. That silence, I would discover, was not protection for the wife. It was protection for the system. Because when there is no language for something, there is also no recourse. There is no appeal. There is nothing a woman can point to and say, "This is wrong." There is only the thing happening, and the sound of it happening, which is almost no sound at all. I married Daniel when I was 19. He was 23, tall, steady, with hands that could split wood for 4 hours without stopping. Our wedding was on a Thursday in November, the way Amish weddings are, with the long benches and the sermons and the singing from the Ausbund and a meal for 200 people afterward. I spent that day so full of something that felt like certainty that I could not have named a single doubt if anyone had asked. Our first child, a boy, came 11 months later. Then a girl, then 2 more boys. Then a girl, 5 children in 8 years. By every measure my community used to assess a woman's life, I was succeeding completely. The 6th pregnancy ended at 4 months. The 7th ended at 3. After the 7th, the doctor, an English doctor I had been permitted to see, told me what my body was now and was not. I drove home in the buggy that afternoon with my hands on the reins and the fields going past on both sides, and I thought, I will tell Daniel tonight. He will hold my hand across the table the way he sometimes did. We will grieve this together. I had grieved with him before. After the 6th pregnancy, he had sat beside me on the edge of the bed and said nothing for a long time, and that silence had felt like company. I believed we were a pair in the way that mattered, 2 people who had agreed without words to carry the same weight. He did hold my hand. He said the right words, quiet and careful. He prayed with me. I thought, this is what a marriage is. You lose something terrible and you are still not alone. I was wrong. But it would take me another year to begin to understand how wrong. My friend Ruth had watched something happen to a woman named Clara. Clara had been married for 12 years and had 3 children, and then, after a difficult illness, could have no more. Within 2 years of that, Clara's husband had begun spending evenings at his brother's farm, not unusual on its own. Then his brother's farm hired a young widow named Anna to help with the cooking and the house, also not unusual. What happened next was the thing nobody said directly, but everyone understood. When Ruth told me about it, she was sitting across from me at my kitchen table, her voice very low, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She said, "The bishop said it was a matter of the household needing to be whole." She paused. She looked at me steadily. "He meant children," she said. "He meant that a man whose wife cannot give him children has a particular kind of need that the community recognizes." I asked her what that meant practically. She looked out my kitchen window for a long moment. "It means," she said, "that arrangements can be made." I remember exactly where I was sitting when she said that. The bench along the east wall of my kitchen, the one Daniel had built the first winter of our marriage. I remember the particular quality of the light coming through the window, the way it fell across the table between us, Ruth's hands around her cup, the word arrangements settling into the air between us and staying there. I did not ask her to explain further. I already understood. I think part of me had understood for months and had been refusing to let the understanding surface. That is what knowledge does when you have been trained your whole life to keep quiet. It goes sideways. It hides in your body instead of your mind. It comes out as a tightness in your chest on certain evenings when your husband is later than usual coming in from the barn. It comes out as you lying awake counting the sounds of the house, the settling of the walls, the wind against the window glass, telling yourself there is nothing to count. Let me explain what arrangements means, because this is the part most people outside Amish communities do not know exists. In old order communities, divorce is not permitted. It is not a tool available to either a husband or a wife. The Ordnung forbids it absolutely, and a member who pursued it would face immediate shunning, the complete severing of all social and spiritual ties with everyone they had ever known. But the Ordnung, for all its specificity about dress and technology and worship, is surprisingly flexible in a particular area. A husband who felt his household was spiritually incomplete, who approached the bishop and the elders with that concern, could find that the community was willing to recognize a secondary arrangement, not called a second marriage, never called that, but a woman, usually a widow, or an unmarried older woman, brought into the household to help, to manage, to be present in a way that answered the need the bishop had decided the first wife could no longer meet. The first wife did not leave. She stayed, in the same house, often, or in a smaller house on the same property. Still wife in name. Still mother to her children. Still expected to attend church and present the appearance of a unified, faithful household, but moved aside. The German word my community used, though not directly in reference to these situations, was beige stelt. Set beside. Placed next to the real thing. I have thought about that word many times in the years since. Beigestellt. It sounds almost gentle in German. In practice, it meant that everything you had built, every morning you had risen before dawn, every meal you had cooked, every child you had carried and birthed and nursed and raised, had been quietly reclassified. You were still present. You were simply no longer the point. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are, so I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts, everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. I want to tell you about Daniel because this part matters, and I will not let him become a monster in this story, because he was not a monster. He was a man who had been raised inside a system that told him clearly what a household was for, and gave him the language and the authority to act when his household fell short of that definition. He did not come to me with cruelty. He came to me with something worse, which was a kind of tired sadness, the sadness of a man who believed he was doing the correct thing. He sat across from me at the kitchen table on a February evening, the lamp burning between us, the children already in bed. He told me he had spoken with the bishop. He told me the bishop had prayed with him and counseled him. He told me that a woman from a neighboring district, a widow with grown children, had been discussed. She would come to help with the household. She would be a help and a presence. He said this word, presence, carefully, the way you say a word that is carrying more than its weight. I sat very still. The clock on the wall. The sound of one of the boys turning over in the room above us. The lamp between us throwing shadows across the table that had been in my family since before my marriage, and that I had brought to this house as part of what I owned, and what I was contributing to the life we were building. I had sanded that table myself the spring we moved in. I had rubbed oil into the wood until it shone. I had set every meal on it for 19 years. I sat at it now and waited for something to feel real. I said, "Is this what you want?" He said, "It is what is right." Those are not the same thing. But in my world, they were supposed to be. I need you to understand something about what the silence around this system costs a woman. Not the practical cost, though, that is real and heavy. I mean the cost of having no language. No one in my life had ever said to me, "This is a thing that can happen to you." No mother, no older woman, no bishop's wife who pulled me aside and said, "Here is what your body becoming unable to have children means in the eyes of this community." The silence around it was the same silence as every other silence. It was called modesty. It was called protection. But what it actually was, as my therapist said to me years later, was the removal of the ability to prepare, to refuse, to grieve something before it happened instead of while it was happening. My therapist asked me once what I would have done differently if I had known. I sat with that question for a long time. I said, I would have grieved the pregnancies differently. I would have understood that I was grieving two things at once and not just one. I would not have spent a year thinking that Daniel's quiet was sorrow, and discovering too late it was calculation. Not cruel calculation, just the calculation of a man who had been given a map and was following it. That map had never been shown to me. That is the whole story. Not Daniel. Not the bishop, not even the widow from the neighboring district, who was also following a map she had been given about what her usefulness in a community looked like. The map itself, and the fact that only certain people were ever allowed to see it. My friend Ruth had watched Clara stay in the house for 2 years after Anna came. She told me Clara would sit in the kitchen in the mornings while Anna managed the stove, and Clara would do the mending, and the two women would be in the same room and not speak to each other because there was no language for what they were to each other. Not rivals, not companions, not enemies. Something the community had created that had no name and no acknowledged shape, and therefore also no rules about how to survive it. Ruth said that one morning she came to visit and found Clara still sitting at the kitchen table at 11 in the morning, the mending untouched in her lap, just sitting, looking at the wall. Ruth asked if she was all right. Clara said, "I do not know what I am supposed to do now." She was not talking about the mending. I have carried that sentence with me since the day Ruth told it to me. It is the truest description I have ever heard of what it looks like when a system discards a woman and calls it order. I did not stay. That is not the ending my community would have written for me, and it cost me things I will carry the rest of my life. The shunning came quickly, the way it always does. My mother's face at the door, my sister's letters that stopped arriving, the particular grief of losing your children's daily life because the custody of Amish children in a shunning is not a matter the outside world's courts were prepared to navigate easily. I will not pretend that leaving was clean or that freedom arrived on the other side of it like a reward. It did not. What arrived was something harder and more honest, the chance to understand what had happened to me by name. After I left, an English counselor asked me to describe what my marriage had felt like in the last 2 years before I left. I used the word that I had been given in therapy: disenfranchised. A loss that the community around you does not recognize as a loss. A grief you are not permitted to grieve because the community has decided it is not grief. It is the order of things. It is the household being made whole. My loss of my body's ability, my loss of my standing, my loss of my husband's fullness of attention, these were not named as losses in any language my community possessed. They were simply the natural consequence of a situation. She cannot have children. The household requires children. Therefore, the logic was clean, and the suffering it produced had no official shape. She told me that what I had experienced had a name in the wider world. She told me that communities across history, in many traditions, had developed similar structures for the same reasons, and that the common thread was always this: the woman's body was the variable, and the system's continuity was the constant, and when those two things came into conflict, the system was not the thing that changed. I wrote those words down on a piece of paper the day she said them. I kept that paper for a long time. The woman's body was the variable. I had spent 19 years of marriage believing I was the foundation. I was the variable. That is not the same thing at all. I thought about Clara in her kitchen, the mending in her lap, the wall she was looking at. I thought about the specific particular silence of two women in a room who have no word for what they are to each other. I thought about every girl in my community who married young and full of certainty and was never told, "Your body can become a reason." I sat with that for a long time. The grief that followed was not clean. It was enormous and specific and full of faces. It was the face of the woman I was at 19, standing in front of a bishop who spoke about fruitfulness and covenant and the ordering of a godly home, and who never once mentioned what would happen to the woman if the fruitfulness stopped. Amish women do not have fewer feelings than anyone else. We are not simpler or less aware. We are raised inside a system that tells us our feelings are subordinate to the order, and we believe it because we have no language for any other possibility. The day someone hands you language for your own experience is the day the world cracks open in a way that cannot be repaired and cannot be undone. That crack is not damage. That crack is light. If you were raised in a world where your silence was called obedience, I see you. If you lost something, a body, a marriage, a standing, and were given no room to name it as a loss, I see that too. Your grief is real even if no one in your world gave it a shape. Your experience inside your own life matters. And if no one in your world ever said those words to you, I am saying them now. Leave me a comment. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me if any part of this sounded like a world you know. And if you want to keep hearing from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. I have so many more truths waiting. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.